Today, so you mentioned the relationship between the artist and the artifact.
Yeah.
That was cool. I was just thinking, I was thinking it might be really cool to talk about satire as, and humor in general as almost like an immune response to tyranny and absurdity and like authority being taken too far, and just sort of like analyzing or diving into how in all, obviously I'm thinking about one specific example which I'll get to in a moment, but in all these like really authoritarian regimes, of which we are on maybe the third floor and just going up or down depending on your, like we are escalating in our our placement on whatever index I'm talking about. But like my background, I'm from the USSR, and I was talking to someone about this the other day, how the more like of a vice grip there is on the sort of like the discourse that happens like in the public arena, the more creative and inventive and sort of like interesting the satire and the stuff that happens behind closed doors is.
Let's talk about humor. You know what? After the Travis Scott episode, we should have something that's maybe a little bit lighter. What do you think?
I'm down, yeah, especially directly after. I think that's a smart idea. I wanted to say something about how I guess I said it already. Yeah, just like how yeah, I guess just how like all of this like woke critical theory stuff has sort of like castrated comedy in a way, because there's all of these, it's like kind of actually in a similar way. I mean, I'm always out here with the metaphors or the analogies. It's like the same way that I think there's actually an attack on like masculinity and just like men and like the energy, the power that men have to be like, all right, I'm putting my fucking foot down. Like, this is ridiculous and we need to take back our world or whatever. I think comedy has a lot of the same potential. It's like a call to arms. You know what I mean? It's like, it's not the militia, but it might be the tavern that the militia meets in, because comedy does bring people together in merriment, but it also, the thing that it draws attention to is often not very merry at all. It's kind of like dark, you know what I mean? And so I feel like, just the same way that like there's an attack on men, both on a chemical and a cultural, level, there's also kind of it's like changing our perception of like, what is a man? Like, is a man like an emaciated, soy boy that like, plays World of Warcraft and has an OnlyFans, that's like his existence while he's vaccinated and being mined for data on like whether he's, ordering more Doritos or cheese puffs if they're vegan. And, versus like, and so same thing with comedy of like, oh yeah, comedy is like, and they show us this thing and it's like, that's not what comedy is. That's like some, I don't know, some sterilized, like, pander approved, Soylent Green version of comedy. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and to put it back in the framework of kind of the original analogy that you made, as far as humor being something of an immune response, the whole idea of saying,
I think
well,
that's true on a personal and a collective level.
right. I agree. And on the collective level, I guess is how I was thinking it for this case particular is, you can't say that or talk about that in front of people. You're a stand-up comedian, but don't talk about, selectively editing, whether tacit, or explicit, um, is basically like saying, well, you're just not allowed to detoxify that area. You can come in and you can make this part better and that part better and talk about, the blockage in this particular part of the system, but you can't talk about, the blockage on that part of the system, or the inoperability or lack of function of that part of the system. We're just not talking about that. So it doesn't have the ability to do what it's supposed to do.
Which ironically, and I love that these metaphors are not being limited, is exactly how the medical system works.
Mm-hmm.
Is literally exactly what you
Mm-hmm.
just said. Oh, you can talk about that, but don't talk about this, because people not knowing about this is what allows the status quo to stay exactly the same. And we're harvesting all of this, capital, let's say, from people not being able to think about fixing this problem or pooling their resources or their knowledge to fix this problem. And so I feel like that's just true at several different places in society where they're like, oh yeah, okay, you can, no, but not this. You can't. If you address that, then like things actually start crashing down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's, you talked about the hierarchy and the pyramid, pyramidal structure of the system. And that's how it works in a hierarchical system. Everyone in the system has to believe that there's somebody above them telling them what to do, and there's somebody below them that they can tell what to do. And if they're on the bottom right now, hopefully they can at least go up to the point where they have one person who they can tell what to do, whether that means you get a promotion or you get enough, time in your job where you have people underneath you, or if you just have kids and now you get to order them around and teach them the hierarchical system and how to be self-policing and obedient to that system. Um, and if they're grown up not exposed to the ability to laugh at some of the irregularities inherent in that worldview, because they're being expunged from the public view due to censorship, whether it's uh, uh, forceful or whether it's self-imposed. People don't want to say the wrong thing. Uh, they never get the chance to take a look at whether the whole system is functioning in a healthy manner or not, or put, to the other metaphor, they never really get a chance to rebuild the building as the drama is of their life is building this structure with its, inherent cracks as people make mistakes and whatnot. But in doing so, they lack the ability to then laugh about the crack or the missed angle or whatever, and go, oh, well, I did that wrong. Let me just go ahead and fix that and make it a little bit better. Because again, again, it goes back to, there's the fear comes in, and the fear is supposed to be the overwhelming emotion, and it's harder to laugh when you're in, fight or flight for sure. It's, that kind of constant, gallows mentality of like, oh yeah, it's all going to come to an end. You can find humor in that a lot more easily than you can find humor in being chased by a tiger while it's occurring. So I think that's a faculty of comedy that, when lost, makes it harder for people to kind of dig themselves out of that hole of not learning how to laugh, combined with, being surrounded by fear.
Although, just to pop in for a second, I think, and with that movie Songbird, that kind of comes to mind, even though that's not necessarily a funny movie. I do think that um, I feel like a theme of this episode is how comedy has been like perverted or weaponized, because there's a lot of that going on, and I feel like
Mm-hmm.
it's its proper function has really been subverted, wherein you can point out the things the way that comedy is supposed to. You can draw attention to or point out the things that are immoral, that are not working, that are absurd, and people can go like with JP Sears, for example. He had a show. I don't remember. I think it was in Philly, actually. That's why I heard about it. And he had a show, and like a lot of people in my community were excited to go see it, and then they found out that the venue that he was going to perform at was requiring everyone to wear a mask.
Mm-hmm.
And
Same thing up here. He came up here in like February or something, maybe
I,
March. I don't remember exactly, but yeah, it was the same thing up here. So
that really
nobody that I knew went.
it really screwed me up, because I was like, what? Like, that's wrong on so many levels, because, and obviously I'm sure he doesn't have control at that level over the venue, but it's just like that. So what I was getting at is, you can point out these things and people are like, ha 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 ha, but then that's it. They don't actually take action. Maybe they don't even realize they can take action. They're just, because of that same kind of permission thing of like, oh, well, yeah, that's funny, but that's the way it is. So the most I can do is chuckle at it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's the most relief I'll get from it, is that brief moment of realizing just how absurd it is. What was the other thing I was going to say? So that's like the one instance. And then the other instance is, you can laugh at something, but then not make the connection that means that the thing is absurd. Like in something like Bird Box. But again, that's why I use that example. It's not necessarily a funny movie, but it's like, I feel like there are humorous moments in it. And it's like basically well, actually, these are just both the same example. I don't know why I'm trying to distinguish between them. By making people comfortable laughing at that, but then that's as far as they'll go, you're basically conditioning them to just get used to it. It's like, yeah, you know what I mean? It's that doesn't create any kind of impetus for like, well, wait a minute, could be. And I think again, it's because of the lack of kind of deeper thought going on, where people just, you know what I mean? Because I think,
yeah, because it's not, and this goes, it's not the particular. This again goes back to why it's not the particular art, the artifact of what art actually is not the artifact. It's the experience of interacting with the artifact.
mm-hmm.
And in interacting with the artifact, you're not, you're not tied to anyone else or the art. The thing itself is that great. It's about the experience, and it's about oh my gosh. He is really needy all of a sudden.
Yeah, I see that.
Dog with me. He was napping, and now he's awake. And now if I stop touching him for just a second, he'll. Anyway, what was I saying? So he was. It's all about. So it's all about the the art is in the experience, and the experience is different person to person. So
right,
it goes back to the whole idea of this whole gatekeeper idea. Is you abandoning your critical thinking to whatever the majority of people or the gatekeepers or your friends or the top 40 says is quality. And when you do that, you kind of put it in the category of, yes, it's good, and stop thinking about it, as opposed to going, well, okay, people might have a certain opinion about it, but what do I think? And so these are all different ways with which it's not really about the art. It's not really about the artifact, I should say. It's about the experience that that person has interacting with it and what that carries on in their life and where they're coming from. And maybe it's something that not everybody's going to go, oh my gosh, I see the light, because they've seen this particular artifact. But when added to other experiences they've had and other experiences that they will have in the future, then they might start going, all this stuff makes me start to go, I should probably start thinking about this a little more critically. And the goal is not necessarily to get people to start thinking or feeling in a certain way, but just to inspire people to start thinking.
Right.
And that's, you know, you can make a thing and put it out in the world and hope people come across, you know, for people to come across and hope that that it inspires them to think. But that's, you know, you've made it. It's up to them now. And so that's why most of the artistic experience, and this is why I wanted to make a podcast to talk about this, most of the artistic experience doesn't happen in the artist's hands. It happens in the experience of whoever's interacting with it. And, you know, it's their interaction with the artifact. That's the artistic experience. And the artist usually isn't even there. Probably in most cases doesn't really have to be there for it. I mean, live performances notwithstanding, but you know, you can still have an artistic experience with Beethoven. He's been dead for 200 and some odd years. Right. So,
I mean, you can have an artistic experience with Lascaux, where we don't even know.
Yeah, even better.
Who or what?
Yeah, which is why I made sure that was a prominent in the intro. I just, as soon as I started thinking about putting it together, I was like, that's. And then a bunch of stuff. And there's as we've talked since I've made it, I've been like, maybe I didn't need to do, you know, 2 Diego Riveras. I could have put in, you know, this person instead, but I just put mostly my favorites.
Yeah, well, I feel like that's the top, you know, thing that comes to mind. You're like, what is art? Since time immemorial, you know, like this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
and Lascaux is it's a great example. It's a great way to think about it in a elemental or fundamental kind of capacity.
And actually, yeah, I think that's I mean, a lot of people would say this, you know, that is like, yeah, that is a fundamental, that is the primordial example of art. And according to your definition, you know, why is that so? Because they just left it there. You know, and it's like now and it's the unpredictability, because what it meant to them and what it elicited in the makers or the viewers of the contemporaries of, you know, the people that were, you know, imprinting that technology on that wall of that cave. As time goes on, there's no way to predict what people will, you know, and once it's in, I think that's honestly the most fascinating thing about art, is like taking it out of context and viewing it, you know, and I think that's why a lot of anthropology is so laughable, is because they're like, well, this is half of all interpretations are like, this is a fertility deity. This is a fertility idol. And it's like,
either it's vague, or you know, attributed to one of these kind of vague, like, oh, it's a pagan fertility ritual, or some kind of nebulous thing, or it's shamelessly anachronistic, where it's like, well, they would have done that because, you know, they wouldn't have wanted to get their trousers dirty.
Right.
Like, this is the Egyptian times; they weren't wearing trousers. That's a modern convention, so that's anachronistic. To, you know, that's a bad example, but think about them in terms of a more modern context, as opposed to trying to view whatever epoch or time that is with some, like, you know, differentiating between what those people would have thought about the stuff that they were doing and what we think about with our modern lens and all that. But yeah, when you talk about Lascaux, I mean, that's the ultimate example of putting it there, not having any idea of what it's going to be. You know, were they thinking, you know, that they were going to hopefully make people stop and go, Who were these people? Why were they here? I'd like to learn more about that time and place and start thinking critically about history and about human art and expression and its evolution, for evolution for lack of a better term. And start to ask these questions. Who were these people? Why did they do this? How were they even able to do this? Both from a technical standpoint, also from a neurological standpoint, from a dexterity standpoint, all these things. And it's those types of things, with whether or not the folks at Lascaux intended for that to be seen and those questions to be asked. They made it for whatever reason. Then they're done. They weren't making it necessarily so that people could experience it as art, and yet they do. People do experience it as art.
Well, and
proving that it's not about the art or the artist or any of these things in singularity. It's about this interaction in space-time with an artifact that has been created by somebody else, really.
I think it's interesting to think about the potential idea that they very likely didn't have a concept for art the way that we do. Like, I feel like in my mind that probably, in my mind, whatever, free associating, I can imagine that being like part of a ceremony to cast some sort of an intention or manifest some kind of outcome with regard to these animals that were being depicted, to I don't know, merge with their spirit and ensure some outcome, whatever, I'm just sort of like, and nowhere in there is like, oh, well, yes, I'd like to, in the future, people will look at this and it will change the way that they view reality. It's like, no, like that's, and I think it's kind of an interesting thing to think about, because I mean, back in the day, like maybe their definition of art was changing the way that like reality and consciousness relates to humankind and not the other way around. How's that for a mind fuck?
Yeah. That's a good point. I wouldn't have any way of knowing this, but I would not be too surprised if that kind of thinking, that kind of worldview were somewhere on some level in the culture or individual mindset of somebody like that. I mean, Lascaux's not just to really get into the meat and bones of comedy here. Lascaux is not really. I mean, it's interesting in and of itself. It's interesting that those images exist and survived. It's really even more interesting that they would choose, and who knows, they might have done it in other places and they got, sands of time. But they did it in that place, and if that was the only place, it's even more incredible, where they knew somehow that the conditions were right for it to exist longer than had it been outdoors or in a cave with closer access. It's down in a cave. Like, it's not just you walk in and it's right there.
Didn't some like French children fall in or something, and that's how they found it?
Yeah, maybe. That may sound vaguely familiar. But the point is, it was kind of an anomaly. It's kind of a, wow, these guys couldn't have picked a better cave to do this in. Like, it's 20,000 or 30,000 or whatever years old. I don't remember. But yet they just picked the cave that, just the atmospheric conditions were right for this to stay fairly true to what it was originally looked like. So that's a fascinating thought too. Were they aware that, oh yeah, let's go, we got to go find this one particular cave, and if that's the case, maybe they were trying to put something that people would see in generations and generations and in perpetuity, and there is more message than, or different message, who knows,
or were there hundreds of caves, and that, exactly like you said, that's just the one that happened to, and then what the fuck was in the other caves? Was it the same thing?
And did they just get lucky, or the other ones get destroyed intentionally? Who knows?
So yeah, I mean, I think we've pretty much covered everything about comedy, in this episode. So with
Yeah,
that
that's a
said,
good place. That's a good place to wrap it.
well, honestly, I feel like I didn't come as prepared as I could have for this topic, but I definitely wouldn't mind coming back to it, maybe
Hmm.
with a little
Oh
bit
yeah,
more of a, bulleted checklist type deal. Because I
sure.
mean, um, definitely, if ever there was a time in the world that we needed comedy, it's now. You know, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, let's talk about comedy then,
Well,
because I liked how you opened into it, and I'll lead off with that as the humor as something of an immune response to tyranny, which as I was writing that tyranny slash lies, just generally, I think, um, was my only kind of like, yeah, also tyranny is also usually rooted in some sort of a lie. And so I think maybe at the heart of it is that it's immune response to a lie or even a, something that's doesn't make sense. Just an instance where two ideas don't work together. They just can't both exist at the same time. One has to be wrong. And you hold them up as both true so that people can, humorously see that that would be a lie to try and tell people that, so I was only joking, which means I was lying on purpose
right.
to show you that it was funny to think like that, in essence. So,
Well, I was just thinking about the definition of art that you gave, or one of, I mean, I don't remember how many we actually went through, but one of the ones that you gave that was sort of fundamental is that, if it's whether it's a painting or a video or a song, the art is not the the manufactured thing, as it were. It is the experience that you have interacting with the thing that results in a change in the way you see the world, or a freeing up of your imaginal faculties of, oh, well, there are other ways of, that I don't have to conceive of reality the way that I did, or I was, or I was conditioned to. And I think it's interesting in that comedy is, as you just said, in a way, the most essential expression of that, because it makes everything visible in a very subtle way. It takes the existing status quo, and I mean, I love comedy, and I think of all of the different ways of expressing oneself, that is the most like automatic, essential. Like, I don't have to think about it. It's just what I do. It's just like comes out. You know what I mean?
mm-hmm.
It's it and
Mm-hmm.
it and that's why I brought in the whole immune system piece. Is I do think that it's like um there's just something about it that diffuses toxicity, because, and so this is what I'm getting at, is I think it's like if you're in a jail cell, if you're allowed to decorate the jail cell, it makes it a lot more pleasant to be there. And I feel like, in a
Mm-hmm.
way, especially in the situation of tyranny, comedy is like decorating the jail cell, but in the hopes that like other
Mm-hmm.
people will see what you're doing and being like, damn, like maybe we can like figure out a way to break out of here, or like at least like, I don't know, make some kind of arrangement with the prison guards where we can like have some more stuff. And I feel like there is it it's interesting, because I think it requires a very high level of skill to do it well, but at the same time, it's also the least subtle by that definition of art that you gave, which is essentially an end product or an experience that someone has in interacting with the end
Mm-hmm.
product of the artistic process, that enables or empowers, or um, yeah, a change in the way that someone sees reality or looks at the world. I think that comedy, satire, humor is sort of the most surefire way of doing that, because just by eliciting laughter or a smile from someone, that is like a pretty surefire signal that there's something happening internally in that person, where they got the first thing, you know what I mean, the setup of the joke, which is like, this is the way things are, and then the punchline, which is like, wow, that's fucking ridiculous. Like, I'm this is being shown to me in a way that is tweaked, that is different in some way. One thing is being juxtaposed with another thing, and the friction and the absurdity between those two things is causing me to actually laugh out loud, because I'm like, wow. And maybe you did see it that way before, but that specific expression makes you see it literally in a way that you didn't see it before. So I guess what I'm saying is, in that way, comedy is sort of the best. It is the epitome of that definition of art that you gave, which is, it's almost like, if someone laughs, it's a guarantee that something has shifted in the way that they view the world, because that's like a symptom of this sort of recalibration of like, wow, that's funny, as in, wow, that's really absurd. Putting those two things next to each other like that really highlights how one needn't think that is the way that things have to be, or the way that things always will be. You know what I'm saying? It's like basically, I guess, to put it more succinctly, the laughter is an expression of freedom. Like, it's the human spirit kind of like coming out and being like, oh, it doesn't have to be like that. You know what I mean? And so I think that's what, to me at least, that's what's so beautiful about it, is that it can cut through anything, no matter how dark. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like other forms of art, you kind of max out a little bit. Like, if things get really, if the bleak dystopia that we are watching advancing, like, goes much further, I feel like there's going to be a serious limit to how much you can reach people with, like, painting or opera.
Right. And that's why they have gallows humor, but you don't have gallows poetry, gallows painting, gallows opera.
Exactly.
I mean,
gallows opera.
There's a certain time.
All my best dancers keep dropping dead.
Any last words? Yes.
Or Sopranos.
Before you kill me, I have an aria to sing.
Right.
But yeah, that's why that's the last form of communicating. You kind of have, and that's why it's one of the kind of basic, I think, psychological reactions, or whatever laughing is. Whatever generates it.
It would be interesting. I'm sorry. So in that book that Mark recommended, The End of All Evil, one thing that stood out to me was, it was saying the most, and this guy really wanted to drive home the point about evil. Some people are like, evil's not real, it doesn't exist. And it's like, this guy is like, no, it does. And you have to understand what it is. And he essentially was saying that basically he was saying that authority is evil, because authority turns natural law upside down and takes away the very core essential truth that as a human being, you have unlimited worth. You have infinite worth. You are like, you're in a very advantageous position. You're not like an animal. You're not like a rock. You're a human. And that's a very beautiful thing to be. And essentially, so what he talks about is how there's a very tight relationship between evil and sort of like authority and control and limiting human freedom, how that is sort of like the fundamental goal of evil. And so in talking about this, he dropped a little snippet that just really made me like, sometimes, and again, this book is not written in complex language at all, which I like about it. And it's refreshing for me to read stuff like that, because I feel like, anyone's reading comprehension will go up when they don't have to like sift through any like, James Joycean kind of like stuff. And he essentially said, I haven't read any James Joyce.
Don't get me started on James Joyce.
I was just using him to prove a point.
I know, that's why I didn't take the bait.
As I so often do.
I love James Joyce's writing. He's one of my favorite fiction writers.
Figured, yeah, no, you spoke highly of him. Well, anyway, so basically, Andy's like, don't even, I'm not engaging with you for a reason. Well, anyway, basically what he said was, I'm nipping it in the bud. I shouldn't have said that. He said that the more a society, the stronger the authority figures in a society, or like the more powerful that culture's belief in authority, the more evil that culture, and the more aggressive, and like the more those
tyrannical
are
and authoritarian.
Yeah, exactly. Like the more evil and atrocity type stuff that culture will invariably perpetrate, because it is this belief in authority that essentially gives excuses and rationalizations to these things that just basic fucking human conscience and respect of others, and just seeing, that essential thing of like, well, freedom is good and anti-freedom is not good. It's bad because it infringes on other people's freedom. Mm-hmm. And so the more you believe in authority, almost by consequence, the more blind you are, to put it one way, to the sacredness of freedom, which is literally the root of everything in natural law. And so he said that, and I was like, that's interesting. And I thought about a lot of these native cultures and a lot of these matriarchal cultures that were kind of like, hey, we need to take care of the kids and have enough food. But like, other than that, it's kind of all good. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like there's no like crazy ideological crusades, or like, oh, well, there's the, because when you get into some of this like monotheistic, Abrahamic, like patriarchal stuff, like that's where it really gets crazy. It's like, well, we already have near total control of everyone, but we think there might be some people shut up in a library somewhere teaching this thing. Mm-hmm. So we have to go find them and exterminate them. Or like, there's some people expressing themselves in the privacy of their own bedroom, but it keeps us up at night. We really want to find them and exterminate them. And it's just like that doesn't seem to happen in these more chill societies that really don't have that authority thing. Yeah.
Well, ultimately, it comes to basically like that runaway, picture the Borg in Star Trek.
Oh, yeah.
That's the runaway level of that evil and that kind of system. And, it's interesting because I'll relate it to the word pagan, not for any religious undertones necessarily, but rather the original etymology of the word pagan was Latin pagani, which meant just people outside of the city, like the folks that lived in the hills, essentially, like those guys out there. And so all of that, all of this, the spreading of the truth to the pagans is very much similar to what you're, saying, as far as, there's one guy in a basement, that's his little fringe, that's his little far afield area, and he's outside of this city system. And we got to go bring the message to him and convert him so he could be a good Roman citizen as well. Mm-hmm. And in doing so, they compromise, rub out a little bit more freedom, and ramp up a little bit more from an authoritarian standpoint, which then the suffering goes up as the aggregate of, freedom, suffering, that whole thing. But so just one quick note before I forget. I told you all about Natural Law Freedom League because, and I'll probably just like repost this to our Odyssey page, but I think Will Keller did a reading of like an audiobook basically on Odyssey of End of All Evil, and it's 6 or something hours long. Maybe it's not that long, but yeah. So if anybody's interested in listening to it in an audiobook, he has done that. I know that it's pretty easy to find PDF versions of the books if you know where to look.
Yeah.
A lot of people actually, Mark might even have it in his website somewhere to be downloadable.
He said, yeah, he said
I
he
wouldn't be
did.
surprised.
I just found it quick. You know, I have my sources.
Yeah.
It's easy. Yeah, the PDF. There were like a bunch of versions of it too.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it is very telling that to get a physical copy of this book,
Mm-hmm.
you have to shell out like $1,200 to $5,000. It's ridiculous. And there's a few. Yeah, that's a good way of just seeing what it is being very actively discouraged. Like there's a couple. There's one book on Kabbalah that I saw on Amazon that was like a paperback. It was going for like just some astronomical amount of money. It's like, what is going on here? You know?
Yeah. And you see that with some editions and stuff, like particular editions of things. I stupidly gave up a copy of, not really gave up. I loaned it to, I trade loaned it to a friend, and then I haven't seen it. If I got a hold of him, pegged him down, and went to his apartment, and he was there, he would give it back to me. But be that as it may, this was like 10 plus years ago. And it was a Paul Foster Case book. And now I can picture the cover, but the title off the top of my head was, I think it was Understanding Tarot or something, but it was a second edition of, I think there were only 4 editions of that book. And it was in pretty good shape. And I loaned it to him and everything. Anyway, but yeah, I've shopped for books like that, and even a really quality copy book like that, which is not necessarily that well known or sought after, but it's Paul Foster Case. So, but yeah, it's not even $100. I think 120 for a really nice one, $90 for a decent, which I don't think is bad for a book that was printed in the 1930s or whatever, and is in good shape and is an interesting, unique edition. But when it's a paperback, that should be $9 because come on, it's a paperback. Yeah.
My friend Mel, she sells books, and she says there's like a, she has a whole formula, but she was saying that certain, like, if it's like, usually if it's past a certain point and how old it is, then it's not valuable anymore for whatever reason. In most cases, obviously, if it's like a Gutenberg Bible, like, you know what I mean? That's different. But, or like the Book of Kells, like something really ancient, obviously is going to be valuable. But she was saying there's like a very specific time period, particularly for like American printed books. And I think it's like the late 30s to like some, maybe like the like mid 60s, early 70s. Like those books are like hard to get a hold of, or whatever. But But anyway,
be an interesting conversation. But
right, I was gonna say back to humor.
Back to humor, yeah.
Well, I think what I think is really fascinating about humor for me is that it is so our culture in general, but American culture specifically, has a very, to me, fascinating relationship with creativity that I think goes to the heart of the point of culture in its negative incarnation, right? Which also is touched on incidentally in this book, how culture is designed to control speech, because cultural norms sort of really, most of what they do is dictate, oh, well, we do this, well, we don't do this, you don't do that, you don't talk about that, you don't think about that, you don't write about that, that's taboo. And so I think it's very telling that in American culture, at least, you have a few people, really a very few people, that will intentionally, consciously, and sort of like demonstratively refer to themselves as creatives, or take on this identity of I'm a creative, I'm a creator, I create things, whether it's, whether you're like a choreographer or an artist or an author or a speechwriter for Obama. Again, there's different degrees of, like again, if you're in advertising, like technically you're a creative, right?
Right.
But that's sort of a different level. But what I'm getting at is most people that I meet, if I were to say, oh, I'm an artist, right? I really like fine art. I've been doing it for a long time. And then maybe I show them a couple things. The vast majority of people, particularly like normies, if you will, who are not interested in changing the world at all and are just like, well, you do this and then you get your taxes. Like they're just like, whatever, like chug a lug lug. They all have, unless there's some sort of a hobbyist, and even then they'll still say this. They all have some version of the same response, and it goes a little something like this. I'll say what they say, and then I'll give my translation. I may have even brought this up on the podcast before. I probably have. This is like a little soundbite. They'll say, oh, wow, that's so great that you do that. That's amazing. That's amazing. And then they look you in the eye in this mock soulful way, and they say, that's so great. Don't ever lose that. That's such a big deal that you're able to do that. That's part one. Part two is, I could never do that.
Mm-hmm.
I could never do that. I'm just not creative. And it's very much, and then this is something like, oh, I'm not creative. I could never do that. It takes such talent. You're just born with it. And I could never do it. And it has a lot of echoes of like, if you visit an insane asylum and you're just like, you're trying to put a lot of distance between yourself and the person behind the glass, where you're like, oh, wow, that's a whole thing. You're probably born like that. I could never be like that. But someone in society has to do that. Someone's got to do that. Someone's got to play that role. So God bless you. And I think it's very interesting.
Nobody's ever like, oh, you're a house painter. That's amazing. Never lose that, because you're applying paint to a thing, but it's a total different, aesthetic. And
I'll tell you what I think.
Nobody says that to house painters. I'm just saying.
When you're a house painter, you're following orders.
Right.
Someone says paint this, and they don't want you to get creative with it. And that is that is the thing that fascinates me about this whole thing, is what those people are talking about when they say, I could never do that. Oh, I can't even draw a stick figure. I could never do that. I could never do what you do. The translation is, I could never, and I will never, as long as I keep internalizing this idea, give myself the permission to freely explore what wants to come out of me, completely separate from and severed from any idea of what will be profitable, what will contribute to my survival, what will people like me, what will make people like me, excuse me, what will, advance my social standing, what will get me more stuff. Because what creativity actually is just going inward and like literally seeing what comes out. It's a very fundamental form of self-expression.
I didn't think that we would just quite this quickly find a way to synthesize the two ideas that I said I would have to think about more before I could try to synthesize. But what you're talking about right now, as far as the expression, mm-hmm. and giving yourself the permission to express, regardless of what that is, obviously without hurting anyone, but to do so in a creative and constructive way, not a destructive way. That thing that comes out, whatever it is that comes out, is that something that artifact or whatever it is that comes out, is that something that the artist should remain attached to? Because really what that is, it's just the releasing of whatever it is, that energy or whatever emotion or thought that they had as they were at that time, at that place, when they said, all right, this is done. I'm done with this thing. It's now an artifact. It's not a work in progress. You have to let it go. That's the whole point of doing it in the first place, right? I mean, that's what you were just saying. The whole point of doing it is because you've given yourself permission to do it. You've chosen to do that. And in doing so, you know, you've got to, and that's what the whole thing is. And once you make that choice, you have to understand that what it is that's coming out of you is not who you are. It's not really even who you are, or it's not really even that you were ever that way. You were just going through the process of understanding or communicating something, and this is part of how it expressed. And now that emotion hopefully has been, at least to a degree, given room to breathe and you know, just be let go and reabsorbed in a positive way with the rest of the psyche. You know, you start to move past it as a person. You start to feel more at peace and ready to move on to the next thing. And even if that thing that comes out appears to be dark, you know, I would say, for example, what was, and I don't know off the top of my head, who knows with these guys, but the guy that designed, he's Swiss or Austrian, designed all the aliens from the films, all those. I'm just totally blanking on his name. He's got a very
I know who you're talking about. His art style is
Geiger.
Mm-hmm.
Hans Geiger, something like that. Anyway, but yeah, he did all the aliens, and he's got, I mean, that whole look of the dark, and I mean that the aliens is kind of, if you look at his work, you know, more extensively, you see that, and even darker and more kind of sinister. And I don't think that he was necessarily, you know, in the interviews and stuff that I've heard him talk, he doesn't seem like a particularly morose individual. He's not a happy, cheerful, upbeat guy, but he's very Austrian. You know, he's out. I paint a painting and I makes this. I like the look of this. And so, you know, he's very, you know, just kind of matter of fact about it. He's got a very strange manner of speaking, but he's interesting to listen to. But just because that's how his expression expresses itself, and I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt that it's his, you know, not he's the person who was selected to bring this look into the world, which is entirely possible, neither here nor there. But just because you have somebody who you look at their artistic style and straight away say, oh, that person must be really dark and demented. Well, maybe. Or maybe they were at the time that they made it. You know, maybe Picasso painted a blue period for only a while because he only was in that headspace for a while. And then he moved on to something else because he had gone through whatever he needed to go through. And, you know, his style changed a little bit and his focus changed a little bit, or what, you know, you don't know. But, you know, you certainly can't presume that, just like you can't presume that guys making, you know, Hallmark holiday movies are upstanding, you know, moral producers or whatever their role is with a film like that. You know, they might be, you know, yeah, use your imagination. It's Hollywood. They could be doing all sorts of shady things, and you wouldn't know it from, you know, All Dogs Go to Heaven at Christmas, Part 2, but nonetheless.
Yeah, I kind of expect, at this point, I almost feel like I expect the people making that kind of like, the more cookie cutter it is, the more I'm like, what the fuck are you doing in your personal life? Like, if you work for, like, I don't know, AMs, I don't know. I'm bad with American pop culture, but yeah, I definitely, like, if you're like making stuff for the Hallmark Channel, like, you are dissolving bodies and lie in your attic. Like, as far as I'm concerned, like, your real life cannot be that boring. But to respond really quickly, I don't know if you were done, but to respond really quickly to what you were saying, I think that it's interesting because part of being an artist that I was never particularly great at is, like what you're saying, releasing the thing, is knowing when you're done. And that's really tough because that's the line between, doodling and experimenting, so to speak, whatever medium you want to apply it to, and saying, okay, now I've polished this enough. It's almost like parenting in a way. Because at which point at which point can you take the training? And I'm not a parent, but I'm not against it. I mean, I certainly have observed other people.
Children.
I've observed other people having children, and I'm like, damn, I almost feel like I should do this just based on how many ways of things I would have done differently from what you're doing. Just jump the fuck out at me, and I mean, obviously, we can always see other people's shit, but I was going to say, I feel like this whole notion of giving yourself permission and yeah, I kind of like dug my claws into this because I was like, oh, this is something I've been wanting to talk about for a while that could really like make up the meat and potatoes of this episode, because I just have so much to say on it. This idea of permission really goes to the heart of like half the things that we've been talking about and bringing up until this point, because that's really convenient if you think about it in an authoritarian or like a very controlling system that likes to limit human freedom, for people to sort of throw their hands up, in a gesture of like, oh, don't worry about me. Like, I'm disarmed. I'm creatively disarmed. You don't have to worry about me. Giving myself the permission to make a statement that goes against the grain, or give a commentary, or some kind of a vignette of like, actually, this is how I feel. You don't even have to worry about me. And they're just, they're like pre-pandering. They're saying, oh, and it's.
And the next stage or next question along that line, not that it's anything other than rhetorical, is, do you think those people with that mindset and that approach even understand art? I mean, fundamentally, if their approach is, I could never give myself permission to try to create it, how much are they giving themselves permission just to try to understand it in a general sense? And so I think that's just kind of a telling.
You're right on the money with that, because I think that I do think they think it's because they've never actually done it. They think it's something other than what it is, or they add they're kind of putting it on a pedestal, if you will, and they're adding in this magical element to it, where I think they think that art is this thing where you go into this like kind of like Neptunian trance, I don't know, like the artist, the person that draws comic books, like does the thing to get in his magical meditative state that is inaccessible to them. And I think part of that, and this is kind of falling back on some stuff that Alan Watts talks about, is that people, this is actually great. I'm so glad that I came up with a way to articulate this. It's because those people fundamentally, whether they realize it or not, think that art is useless, and they think it serves no function. That is my thesis, because they think that there's this sort of practical humdrum reality where you do stuff to feed your kids, and you put food on the table, and you accumulate wealth, and you do whatever. Never mind the fact that, Netflix and Amazon and Disney are very busy serving up steaming pile of one thing after another that technically is done the same way art is done. But instead of being like, hey, oh dear Lord, instead of being like, hey, something's not right here, they're just burying you deeper in status quos and, you know what I mean, and sort of cultural conditioning. And so I just think it's interesting, because that it's similar to the separation of like the physical world from this like higher magical spiritual realm. That's how these people see art. There's like the world, which is very like kind of cut and dry, and you just, you do your thing and you don't really step out of line because that puts you at risk. And then there's these quote unquote brave, maverick artist people who just are doing something else. And that's why I say maybe they wouldn't consciously say, I think art is useless, but I would say if you asked them what is art for, they would be all question marks, because they don't think that the world can change.
Right.
Whether they think that it should change or that it will change, they fundamentally do not think that the world can change. And so that pursuit of changing consciousness is a fruitless one to them. And again, I think a lot of this is taking place at a subconscious level. But, and so as a result, these people are cutting themselves off from that permission. And again, the reason I bring up the thing about spirituality and religion is it's similar, because it's like, oh, well, God takes care of those things. Which, if you kind of translate it as in terms of like what effect does that have on how these people conduct themselves in their lives? What it means is, I'm waiting for some external savior to fix everything, or to actually take action. Basically, yeah, well, action happens from this magical, invisible, remote realm. That's where higher knowledge is. And that's where change sort of streams down from. That's where, causes and effects are known. Like, that's like I'm just down here, I'm just a hapless peasant caught in the cogs of this machine. And it's interesting because as I'm studying comparative mythology, I'm getting a lot into this, and that's why I like that book really brought this to the fore for me, because it talks about how the more sort of obedient to authority a culture is, the more they will limit human freedom and perpetrate evil. And it's like, damn, that is so true, because everything is constructed in this way. The whole mythology is like structured in this way where you always need to ask permission from the guy who's one rung above you. And when it's that remote, with something like art or with God or spirituality, it's like, I think a lot of the time people don't even know who to ask, but they can't give it to themselves because they've been conditioned over and over and over again that if you are going to create something really at all, but let alone if you're going to create something that influences the world, you better be like a man of means. You need your letters after your name and your accolades, and you need all your sort of accoutrement if you're going to birth something out into the world other than, a child.
You've got to say the right things. You've got to look the right way, I mean, yeah, it's, you got to be, at least just as or slightly less scandalous than like Elon Musk, and you'll be okay. Say some stupid, crazy shit about weed in your Twitter and smoke pot with Joe Rogan one time, and people will be like, yeah, okay, he's kind of eccentric, but like an acceptable way, because obviously he's rich from all of his Tesla money. It's not why he's rich, but that's neither here nor there.
Right. Yeah, and he's like a fucking arms dealer or whatever. Yeah, well, so the reason I bring all of this up is, and I'm going to let you talk for a minute, but I think comedy is, it's like, it is both the epitome of that, but it's also the one thing that flies under the radar, because most people, actually, I guess it's not, because there are a lot of really dry, humorless motherfuckers walking around, unfortunately. But yeah, it seems like basically in a similar way, people don't give themselves permission to do satire. That's what I think, that
Hmm.
in a way all art is satire, because it's through creating something you're poking fun at the collective dream, if you will. Do you see what I'm saying?
Hmm. Hmm.
You pick up the thread, because I feel like I'm losing myself a little
Well,
bit
yeah,
here.
no, this is so really, I mean, basically what I think, to kind of tie into what you're saying before I'll take it to my next kind of jumping off point, but what you're essentially saying is nobody wants to do satire because nobody wants to say the emperor wears no clothes. Nobody wants to stand up and say the thing that everybody's thinking or aware of on some level, but they don't
Bingo.
want to stand up and be the ones to say it. So, um, that's problematic, and I think part of the as you were talking about, people, don't feel like they, have this moment with most art. Like, yeah, people might go into, I don't know, what was that, wherever it is in Milan, I think, and go up to the statue of David, and you might go, oh my gosh, you don't have that moment where you're just like, oh wow, that's really impressive. That's something else, and you feel a certain way. Um, and maybe you don't know why. Maybe you do think about why, or maybe you don't, or maybe you don't really feel that much of anything other than, oh yeah, that is impressive. I agree with you. Like, because everybody's here looking at it. Obviously, it's impressive that So that's why we're all here. It's essentially like, well, I'm just here to check it off the list because everybody tells me that it's important. Um, which is not, you're probably not really having an artistic experience, just kind of a, bucket list check off experience, which is what it is. But if you do have that moment, and this is kind of where I'm taking it towards, there's a phenomenon that's described that's called Stendhal Syndrome. I don't know if you've heard of it, but Stendhal Syndrome is essentially a psychological condition that arises when a particular person comes across a work of art so marvelous that they literally lose the ability to kind of come out of that, like, awe, that state of awe. And usually it's like, I mean, it's kind of theoretical and fairly rare, and as much a plot point in novels as it is a psychological condition. I mean, I'm guessing it exists. I'm guessing it has but just that idea. Okay. And even, if you just have it for a moment, because it's not really like it's not, I mean, it's not like, syndrome is probably the wrong word for it, but I
Well,
think
now
they
that we're
attached it.
medicalizing everything, which makes
Well, yeah,
sense.
but this is like, that's 100-year-old concept. It's a fair, but the concept is just that you're so enamored of a work of art that it, causes you some sort of change in your, and maybe just lasts for a second or two where you're just like in such awe, and maybe it lasts for a little bit longer. Maybe you have this particular thing with this one work of art, and it's like some people have to compulsively go to see this movie or watch this movie on the same day every year, or whatever it is, because they're just enamored of this experience that they have with it. So maybe that's a kind of example of a day-to-day thing, but that ability to get people interested and enamored and have a reaction that's on a psychological, physical level, where you kind of, your thinking kind of changes, and your emotion, you feel something, and that kind of changes even just for a second. That whole Stendhal syndrome is essentially what laughter is. It's just Stendhal syndrome. Usually it's more like, oh, this great work of art, and you're just like, oh. Whereas with laughter, it's the same thing. You're just responding to, and this goes back to what, I don't think I've brought it up on the podcast yet, but I know we talked about it when we were doing planning and pre production and all that stuff. But drama is the building, comedy is the breaking. And that's true on many levels, if you ask me. And not to go too much into the drama side, but it's slowly, usually slowly building things and seeing if people are building them correctly or not. And if you see, this didn't get built right, this didn't get built right. So then as the roof goes on, the whole structure kind of collapses or doesn't look right or whatever. And because you saw those different points go in as it was being built. Whereas the comedy is taking that slightly crooked house and saying, see, if we tweak that, it would be this is the inconsistency in this and that idea, and it changes the house. Maybe it doesn't make it into a perfect mansion that's but you're pointing out the breaks within what's been built, and that drama, the building itself is essentially the status quo. What status quo? It's kind of sounds maybe like a oxymoronic concept that you're building the status quo. But, in a way, the status quo that you have today is likely to be the one that you have tomorrow unless you build a new one. So just, just even being, I guess, conscientious of what the status quo is, and if it's something that you want to go on being a part of, or if you want to stand up and say the emperor has no clothes, But laughter is a good way to get people, and I think people laugh more, if that's a little mini Stendhal Syndrome experience when they laugh. They have a lot more of those than they have, these big artistic moments. Yeah, you might see a film that makes you go, oh, wow. But, comedy, you get it. You get it in particularly with stand-up comedy, you get it in packets, and you get it in usually the formed and structured and crafted ideas of one person. By and large, stand-up comedians write their own material and generally work alone outside of little, mechanical, just having somebody to kind of look at you because you can't see yourself while you're doing it. Anyway, point being that, I think that Stendhal Syndrome moment that laughter may be a tiny, bit of, is like a miniature version of that, swell that people might feel at the rising of some Schubert concerto or whatever. Some people have that experience that are listening to a certain a piece of music, and you have that swell, and you're just wrapped, and it's just you're experiencing something. And like in an opera, it can be drawn out. There can be a very particularly poignant note or a moment or something that may last several seconds, whereas you might laugh at something in less than a second, and yet it's still maybe even exponentially stronger, even though it's smaller. I don't know, but that was my thoughts.
Yeah, I wrote down a couple of really cool stuff that came up for me. So first of all, yeah, I think the thing I'm really glad you brought up Stendhal Syndrome. I think it seems like it's like akin to that that bliss experience in a way, and it could still be drama. It's like that experience of like the bottomless depths of human feeling or whatever. And I think so. This just came up for me. Well, first you were talking about, before you explained what that meant, I was thinking about something, and I called it the gatekeeper effect. So this is two concepts I want to play with art, where, so you have, and this is, let's say, like, I don't know, like if like Saturday Night Live is art or stuff like that, stuff that you would see on TV. Let's say for a moment that is art. And there's a lot of like my one friend, she was saying she was watching Curb Your Enthusiasm, and she was like, yeah, it was okay. And I guess it was a newer episode. She was like, but the liberal propaganda is on another fucking level. Like, they like found a closet full of hand sanitizer, and they were like, he's a COVID hoarder. He's a COVID hoarder. And I was like, if I heard the word COVID in a show, I would shut that shit off and never watch it again. No, or whatever. Or like some guy's name was Don Jr. and he was like, oh, you really ruined that name. Trump's, now you can't even be Don Jr. anymore. And so it's like,
yeah,
dating yourself as like new. I don't know. I'm not into it. But what I was going to say is it's interesting how that's creeped in. It feels like more and more, and it is like liberal propaganda. And now it's the reason I call it gatekeeper effect is it's almost like the art, quote unquote, extremely conservative definition of art over here, or I should say extremely liberal, no pun intended, definition of art, calling that stuff art. That stuff is like the litmus test. It's almost like the lie detector test, or like the are you part of the empire that answers to the Sith Lords? And it's like, you can show people this stuff, and then it's like, especially with how much surveillance tech there is now or whatever, it's like if you react the way you're supposed to react, which I guess can be fairly easily extrapolated based on your social media behavior and stuff like that, then it's like, okay, he is essentially supportive of the status quo. Whereas if you don't react, then just by nature of how the culture works, you're going to start to be ostracized because you're like, oh, I didn't find that funny. Or, yeah, I guess it was kind of funny, but I'm really kind of over this liberal propaganda. Whereas other people are like, what are you talking about? That's not happening. So I don't know. I termed that, I just came up with this, or maybe, I guess I probably didn't, but I came up with this whole gatekeeper effect thing where it's like a way of parsing out and sifting through who is enough of a critical thinker that they're like, no, wait a minute, no, I don't like that or whatever, versus people that are like, oh, this is what's expected of me. Okay, yeah, laugh or smile and nod. So that was the first thing. The second thing was, I was also thinking about, because you were talking about the status quo and a lot of people are talking about this Facebook whistleblower.
Yes.
And how like it's very
this is the one who said that Facebook wasn't doing enough to stop bullying or something, and the government can do more.
Exactly. Yeah, okay. Facebook doesn't. Yeah. So I think it's really interesting because what that does is it says the status quo is off. We need more of what's already bad, and then people are like, yeah, and so it's very interesting because then that is where, I mean, that obviously wasn't art, but I think that can and does happen with art, where you're taking this sort of synthesis or fusion of controlled opposition and putting things out into the public consciousness, where it's like drawing attention to something about the status quo where a decision's already been made that, like, they want to slide the bead more to the left or to the right, and they just need people to get behind it. And so it's just very, it's very intentionally done. Like, yeah, well, actually now we want you to question the status quo because we've already decided what we want it to shift to. And then the last thing I wanted to say is, with regard to the Stendhal Syndrome, I think that is one of the ways that they're able to sort of cast more and more of this like degeneracy into culture, because I think that sort of phenomenon of what you were terming Stendhal Syndrome, where someone is overcome, right, with a piece of art, or at the very least you could say they enjoy it or it affects them, right, enough that they're overcome with whatever. And I just think it's interesting because the more you get people to act as though a certain artist or a certain genre or a certain type of art or albums or works that come out of a particular person are having that effect, when really they suck. But if enough people are like, oh, he's so, like, I don't know, like Jackson Pollock or whatever, someone like that who you're trying to get a new thing going. Or like, for example, something that I have virtually no respect for is like the new, like, kind of like trap hip hop. I just want to call it like yelping, because that's really all they're doing. Like, they put on a beat and they're like, hip, hip. Like, that's not, I don't know what the fuck that is, but then as you get people, especially established artists and musicians, to line up and say, oh, wow, yeah, this is one of the best albums of 2016. then it's you know, it's very like, it's very meta, because the sort of like, again, the peasantry is watching all this parade of people on TV, this parade of quote unquote established artists coming out in support, and in not even support or defense of, but in like adoration and praise of this stuff that is literally not even art. It might not even be noise. You know, it's just some new category of what, I don't know, you know, and yet they're like, oh yeah, this is, you know, the and they'll just laud it with praise, and then that changes people's definition of what is art, what is good, what is pleasurable to expose yourself to and consume. And even on a more fundamental level, I think it takes them away from, like, in order to create art, you need some level of skill. Like, you're not just gonna, you know, like, if you have someone throw a frisbee at you and your pants down and try to defecate in the general direction of the frisbee, like, that's not art, because it's just, I don't know what the fuck that is, but that's how I feel about some of this music. Is it's people literally, I mean, I'm all for experimentation, but it's like, you have to know something about something in order to experiment. You know, they say you have to learn the rules before you can break them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in this case, I feel like a lot of people don't even know that there are rules, you know, or that they don't. I think people, this is, I'll get to a point or something like it. I think people are losing the plot with the fact that art is supposed to make you feel something either good or something poignantly bad enough that it makes you look at something in the real world, right? Which again goes back to your original definition.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas now it's just sort of turned into this thing of like, oh, hey, you know, anyone can be an artist, and like, yeah, just like shit on 2x4 and like put it at Art Basel. You know what I mean? It's particularly in music, it's getting to a point where I think that Stendhal syndrome has been almost weaponized, because if you get enough people to basically say, wow, look at the Emperor's new clothes. Oh my God, they're so beautiful. They're gorgeous. Like, look at that lush fabric. Oh my goodness, the embroidery. That's what's happening with a lot of this stuff that's coming out. And so it almost it bulletproofs it from someone coming out and being like, this is garbage. And it's like, no, enough people have said it was good that you're crazy. You know, never mind the fact that, you know.
And, you know, that's been going on since, and various guys, it's been going on for a long time. But I think one of the most interesting examples for me is if you start to look at how the top 40 in music gets put together. It's just the record companies getting together and deciding. I mean, it's because it's what's being played most on the radio, and what's being played most on the radio is whatever the record companies are sending to the radio stations to tell them, this is the single, this is the song you play. And the same companies that own the radio station own the record label, so it's all a wash anyway. But you brought up Gatekeeper, and it made me think of a meme, all courtesy of the Grateful Disobedient meme cast. Then it was just, as soon as you said it about SNL, I was like, oh, I got to put, so I don't know 100% if this is, I don't have a source for this quote, or if this meme is true, if this is his actual words or not, but it's interesting, and I think it's to your point. So this meme, again, don't know that this is news, don't know that this is real, I haven't checked it, I haven't done the research, so I'm just letting people know. Rob Schneider on SNL, quote, much late night comedy is less about being funny and more about indoctrination by comic imposition. People aren't really laughing at it as much as cheering on the rhetoric. It no longer resembles a comedy show. It's more like some kind of liberal Klan meeting.
Wow.
Was his a quote that's been attributed to Rob Schneider, who was on SNL for, I don't know, 5 or 8 years, maybe longer. I don't really remember how long he was on, but
that is a really nice find.
I will drop that. Oh, man. We were just talking about it, so it's good timing. Cancel stop share, but stopping the share. Okay. But yeah, so I thought of it. I'll put that in the
Yeah, and I mean, that's someone coming from the inside, sort of blowing the lid on that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and there's a reason I brought up SNL. I feel like SNL is the most egregious example
Yeah,
of that
it's a great
because
example.
so many people, now are like, and because I mean, 20, 30 years ago, didn't, or maybe it didn't seem like that. It did not seem like that. You had, but also I think because political correctness wasn't really where it's at now.
Yeah, yeah.
It was more like,
It was. I mean,
or at
it
least
is one step at a time, and it certainly was happening in the '90s. It's just was 15 steps back in this little.
I think political correctness didn't really used to apply to comedy.
Oh yeah, I mean,
It's because I think because in a society that has like any of its wits still about it, it's like, well, this is the release of tension. This is
mhm.
where we go to release tension. So if we have like the armed guards of wokeism and critical everything theory of everything, if we have that whole weaponized apparatus active here, then there's not going to be any release of tension. There's just going to be more tension.
Mhm.
And I think that's why, I don't know if you ever look at some of these like kind of like social justice flavor people trying to do comedy, it is the most excruciating thing ever
Well,
because
that's
it's
JP
exactly what that quote, yeah.
JP Sears. Shout out to JP. He's basically just talk about satire, modern satire.
Mhm.
He's just satirizing all of those people that you were just describing. I mean,
Yeah.
essentially, that's I think his thread for most of what he does is just I'm going to satirize the people who have the mindset that you were just describing there. So,
How many other people do what he does?
not very many. There's a few, but not very many that I know of
Because
anyway.
like I've actually had a lot of ideas for those types of skits, even just this week. And yeah, my friend was laughing really hard because it blows my mind. I don't know if I'm just really curious. Like, I don't know if more people are doing it, but it's hard to get big or get popular or be seen because the algorithm is like, how dare you be insensitive to
Hmm. Hmm.
anything? And
Well,
but it's just
there's some fun shit on Odyssey and BitChute. I can't remember the name of there's an animated. It's like they're two ducks, I think, on a farm, and it's animated,
yeah, that is really funny
and it's really
actually.
funny. And they're
Mhm.
short episodes, and they're always beating each other up because they're animated or puppets or whatever. They are puppets. Anyway,
No,
yeah,
I
but
think
there's
the
there's
ducks
stuff
are
like that.
animated. Yeah.
There's stuff like that. And then the other one's what's Brent something or other that I think is also lives in Austin or wherever in Texas. The JP Brent.
Brent Pala,
Yeah, he's another
Paella.
one, but I think they're in a, and he's not as he's more broad social commentary and like he has some obvious, but yeah, I mean, there's just not a ton. They're getting a lot of I think a lot of the I wouldn't be surprised, I should put it this way, if a lot of the people who are really doing this satirically were doing it through animation or puppet or some other sort of very YouTube friendly, like Bitcoin and Friends. Like that's just a well edited, fun show.
I've never seen that.
It's on Odyssey and stuff, but yeah, it's just this animated. The main character is Bitcoin, and it kind of, he's a cartoon character and kind of goes through the life of Bitcoin, living, as this character and growing up, and like, so it's kind of this weird sitcom thing, but it's funny, and it's not
That
really
sounds
a,
funny.
yeah, it's not really a satire. I mean, it's just kind of funny and stupid.
Do you think they do interesting? Do you think they do that as like a almost like a pen name type deal to protect themselves from
Oh no, I think they're all listed, the credits and stuff.
the woke? No, but I mean people who do it and oh yeah, I guess so. People
I
who
mean,
do
for
it
that
and
instance,
like animation.
yes and no. I think for whatever reason,
It just works.
people who have learned graphic animation on a computer and have those skill sets to make graphic videos and stuff like that, or animated videos, or they tend to be a little more, let's see what we can do with it to begin with. I feel like it was kind of a unique little pocket, and you got those people who learned that skill set and, you know, came up and at some point contacted anarchism or contacted natural law, came into contact with some of these ideas and went, okay, so I'm an animator, and now I'm meeting these other people, and I've kind of got this new thought process, and now we're going to find some writers and let's start writing that kind of show to do it, because that's what we know. Whereas I think a lot of people who might make more stand-up-y, I think, type of a comic approach are either going to do more news-based weekend update type humor, or they're going to tend not to have such a streak and try to find a way to work some of that a la Bill Hicks or George Carlin into their routine, or Dave Chappelle, even to an extent recently, to kind of work that into the routine, to kind of say, all right, let's pump the brakes on all this woke ass shit. And put it in a way. But then there's still, you know, a lot of the times, and I don't fault either of the creators necessarily, but for Bill Hicks and George Carlin, you know, it's hard with the sample size on Bill Hicks because he died fairly young. Carlin's a much broader sample size, and he
he became Alex Jones.
Or he became Alex Jones. In which case he wasn't doing stand-up, so or maybe he is doing stand-up and we just don't realize it, and it doesn't matter. Yeah, Alex Jones is just an awesome freaking joke. It's the most meta Andy Kaufman joke of all time. He fakes his death. He comes back as Alex Jones. He thinks it's fucking hilarious. He's not actually angry. That would be a really, really funny joke.
I had to throw it in there because I'm fascinated by it.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by it because I hadn't thought about it or heard that, and you said it, and I was like, well, I can't unsee that now ever. Because anyway, but I don't want to pick on those guys. But, you know, in order to get, you know, because there's always a compromise for somebody. I'll take Carlin. He's a good example. There's always a compromise between staying notable enough, staying relevant enough to still get a chance to be on a HBO-like broad and, you know, important platform in people's eyes. And just say enough to get people thinking, but not say so much that you lose your ability to reach more people in the future. And Carlin did a pretty good job walking that line, I think. I think if he'd have gone much farther on some of his stuff, he wouldn't be back on HBO next year. At the same time, he kept going on HBO because he had all that tax stuff that he was in hot water for, you know, basically doing a show a year on HBO live show every year because he had to pay his IRS bills, which
really,
yeah. And he talks about, and anytime he, you know, interviews where he's talked about his tax, you know, so at the end of the day, just pay your taxes. In interviews,
he says that.
Yeah. Or
wow.
He has said that in particular interviews based on, you know, and they might have been morning show interviews as opposed to, I'm sure he didn't say that on Letterman without at least getting a laugh. So yeah, it might have been a morning show kind of thing that he's, you know, fluffier. But yeah, at the end of the day, I think the most authentic thing about Carlin, and I don't know why we're talking about comedy. We can talk about Carlin. One of the most authentic statements I think that Carlin made that I've heard that seems to be accurate, even though obviously I never met the man, never knew him really in any way outside of the work and some interviews that I've seen. Jesus Christ. I just like freight trained. Totally. Tax thing. Where are they going with that? Going far enough. I don't know, man. I just like all at once just totally ran into a wall with my train of thought. Carlin, popular, paying taxes, interviews.
Letterman, daytime, fluffier. He would say it
Yeah,
on
but ultimately, I
19.
just think at the end of the day, I'll see if I can circle back to it. I think at the end of the day, you know, he did a pretty decent job, all things considered, of trying to put a message out there in a humorous form so that people could understand it and eventually work their own way towards a little more truth and a little more truth. Because I think ultimately, I talk to so many people that are critical thinkers, you know, that are gratefully disobedient, that are attempting to possess their internal monarchy and self sovereignty in every way, shape, and form possible. And something that often is a very easy getting to know you icebreaker kind of question or topic is comedy. And if you do that, George Carlin, Bill Hicks almost always come up pretty quick. I think that Bill Hicks definitely, and Carlin to a different extent, because I think Bill Hicks kind of did more in less time. Carlin did a little less here and there, but over time it was, you know, comparable. It's not really quantifiable anyway, but point being, I talked to so many people that were influenced by their comedy, whether they were starting to think about things because of him or were thinking about things and then heard him and he reinforced or whatever it is. You know, so for what it's worth, and again, it's not about George Carlin as an individual to me. I mean, that's between him and his creator. Even though I'm pretty sure he was an atheist. So, nonetheless, it's the work brought many more people into a space where they could ask these questions. You know, you didn't need to know the artist. You didn't need to meet George Carlin. You didn't really even need to see an interview of him or know anything about him. You can see one of his stand-up, one of his jokes, one of his rants, and you don't need anything else. I mean, it's self-contained, and the art, the actual work, the artifact stands on its own. And he's another good example because he works so much that he was constantly, okay, that's done. Now I've got 1 year to write an entirely new 90 minutes of comedy. So now I got to go back out onto the road 300 days a year and keep touring and retooling and rewriting and honing so that in a year I have a new product. And what was the last product? It doesn't really matter because that artifact is in the past and I have to work towards the next one. And, you know, so that relationship of, you know, and granted for him, I think it came from a place of he felt coerced to perform essentially by the IRS, which is interesting. But, you know, it's how he continued to process and continue to expand and continue to keep finding little ways to get that message in. Because if you're talking to a bunch of people once a year for an hour and a half, you can put a couple little things here and there and people can start to draw some threads together. So, you know, I appreciate George Carlin. I'm sure the man wasn't a saint, but I appreciate George Carlin's work. And I think he did a pretty good job from my perspective. I could be dead wrong of saying enough to not lose the ability to say more so that more people long run could be reached, even if it was with just little seeds. Whereas I think Bill Hicks was a little bit more of a, he's handing you a plant, you know, a small plant instead of a seed. It's like, here, take this, go grow it, keep watering it.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I can't say I'm super familiar with Bill Hicks's work. I'm allowed to say that. I just know a lot of people love him. A lot of the people that I love love him. So, yeah, I don't know. I feel
he's
like
a funny guy. I feel like grainy stand-up comedy sets from the early 1990s. Yeah, he's pretty darn hard to beat.
I feel like I love everything from the early 1990s at this point. I'm discovering. It's just like
I might have told you this already. I've discovered the single greatest year of for movies in my lifetime.
I'm listening.
1999.
Oh yeah, I could have told you that.
Okay.
Honestly,
So
and
I
I'm
didn't
not a
discover
movie
it.
buff, but like all of my favorite movies were made in like 99 or 2000. Like I mean,
2000 was quite good too, but
it was like an explosion of amazing films. Like 99 specifically though.
yeah. Yep. Okay.